Hi everyone, Steve Johnson here. Welcome to another episode of the Truth2Lies podcast. Today we're going to talk about Brian Laundrie and the letter that he wrote. It's his deathbed letter. There's been a lot of talk about this letter, a lot of talk about this case and speculations flying. And I'm going to address two of the main questions regarding this case, regarding this letter. And number one is, was Brian Laundrie suicidal? There's a lot of speculation of whether or not he had assistance in committing suicide. So we want to know, was he actually suicidal? And so I'm going to show you some traits in the handwriting that I think will answer that question. And then the second thing is he telling the truth regarding how Gabby died? So there's a lot to this letter, but I'm going to focus on the section where he talks about the time that Gabby died. And so, you know, I've seen news clips and newspaper articles where they say that Brian Laundrie in his letter described the last traumatic moments that were so difficult for him when Gabby died. I want to know from his brain exactly what he was experiencing and feeling, and his words will reveal it. Those words came from his brain, and his brain formulated the statement. He wrote it. It took more time and effort to write that out, and as such, it is going to be reliable for us, and it's going to reflect what was going on in his brain at that time and what his thoughts were, what his perspective was, what he was experiencing. That's the most wonderful thing about what we do, the linguistic profiling. It reveals that. And so let's take a look at what he was experiencing, okay? The first thing I want to look at is the very beginning of his letter. So this letter, he addresses it to Gabby. In the beginning of the letter, that is exactly who he is speaking to, or would have us believe he's speaking to. And I, you know, for the most part, he is remembering and reliving moments with Gabby. He's has feelings about what he did, obviously, and so he's expressing that. Later on, it switches, and the letter's not to Gabby, it's to whoever else is reading the letter, whoever that might be. And I have a feeling about who exactly that might be, who is the most important secondary recipient of this letter. I'll address that later on towards the end. In the beginning here, he says Gabby. And I want you to notice in his handwriting, he's writing this on lined notebook paper. It's obviously in a little notebook. You can tell that from the photocopy. And it's lined paper. He writes Gabby on the lines, although Gabby's a little up off the line. And then he does not follow the rules of staying within the lines. At this point in time, while he's talking to Gabby, he begins by writing in an uphill ascending baseline up off the line. And the first line he says is, "I wish I was right at your side." And the I goes down below the baseline, and then the wish starts on the baseline, on the line, and then it starts ascending up off the line. The next I is up off the line, and then was is even higher and continues to ascend up to the right. and continues to do that. I wish I was right at, and the word at is up the top of the line above it, or at the bottom of that line above it. Then he starts the next line, your side, pretty much on the line, and then it starts ascending again. And so he starts out, and he is in this state of mind. It tells me that he's in this state of mind where the rules no longer apply to him. Now, I don't know what he normally writes like. All I can compare this to is what he writes like later on within this same letter. And after he writes to Gabby, his writing is pretty much on the line. It's a normal baseline. He follows the guidelines of the lines that are there for him to follow. And so he stays within those boundaries when writing on the line. So a couple things going on here. There's a high percentage of CEOs that write in an ascending baseline. They write over the lines. They don't follow the rules. They do whatever it takes. They're upbeat, upgoing. They're going somewhere, and they just write uphill. Okay, that's very typical of a lot of CEOs, and it's really a good trait for someone that's going to get something done. That is not really the case here. I'm not saying that Brian Laundrie has this mentality of being a go-getter, a CEO. What's happening here is he just simply is in this state of mind where the rules no longer apply to him. And so why try? And he is trying to write this in a way, he knows this is going to be seen by a lot of people, I suppose, or at least by a certain amount of people. And he's trying to be upbeat for them. And I think that he may have some pretty good memories of Gabby. They were together for a while, and in any relationship, you have some good times, and I'm sure they did have some good times. And I'm sure in remembering those, especially in the context of where he is at right now mentally, he's remembering those good times, and it is an elevating thought for him. And so it lifts him, and that's why you see the writing ascend uphill to the right. Okay? Now, it continues to do that on his page. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 7 lines, maybe 8. And then things start to change, maybe 9. He still ascends up to the right, and then he gets to this line. Let me see if I can find it, because it's hard to read his handwriting. It is not because the writing is bad, but because it is the ink is blotchy. And I'm going to get to the line where the writing begins to change, and it's where he says he's talking about the things he'll never be able to do again. And when he says never go hiking, so what he says is, I'll just read the first part here. I wish I was right at your side, and all this is ascending up to the right, and I'll tell you when it changes. I wish I was right at your side. I wish I could be talking to you right now. I'd be going through every memory we've made, getting even more excited for the future. I can't live without you. I've lost every day we could have spent together, every holiday. I'll never get to play with, and I can't read that again, never go hiking. Right there, never go hiking. The word hiking starts to then slant down to the right. So hiking began to go up to the right, and then at the end of hiking, it tapered off, like he can't keep this up. And when they are feigning this emotion or feeling trying to be upbeat for whoever they're writing to, and they're writing up, if they are truly suicidal, They cannot keep that up. And when he says, never go hiking, it falls off. And then he starts a new line. With TJ, I loved you more than anything, and anything falls off again. This is classic suicidal behavior in the handwriting. Looks like I can't bear to look at our photos, and photos tapers off. This all goes up. It's like in this like a big old upside down V shape. I can't bear to look at our photos, to recall great times, and then it falls off because it is why I cannot go on. When I close my eyes, I will think of laying on the roof of the van, falling asleep. And every time he tries again, he tries a new line, and he tries to be upbeat, and then it falls off. And it goes on like this, line after line after line, until he said, I will always love you. I will always love, tapers off and goes downhill. It's a downhill slant, descending bass line. That's a depressive bass line. And so this right here, this writing is very typical of someone that is suicidal. This is in classic indication of a person that is suicidal. So now the question is, why does this change? Because on the very next page, he starts to address other people. He says, if you were reading Gab's journal, looking at the photos from our life together, flipping through old cards, you wouldn't want to live a day without her. And so he's clearly writing to somebody else, okay? Whoever's going to find this. And in the end, it'll end up, he knows, with his family. Now, all these other pages, he is writing on the baseline. He's writing a straight line. He's following the rules. So what happened? Well, this is also classic. Now, the thing that we don't know is if he wrote this all at the same time, or did he write that first page to Gabby and then he didn't write for a little while. Whatever the case is, what I know is that that first page, he is feeling suicidal, okay, and he can't continue it on. He can't continue that upbeat thing. And he tapers off. He runs out of steam. He doesn't have it within him to continue on, and he's falling off. He continues to fall off over and over and over, and can't get it together. Okay, so what happened now is that as he continues to write to other people, he has come to terms and feeling okay about taking his own life. He has made peace with that, and so the rest of his writing is okay. And this is typical. If you take that behavior, the handwriting is a linguistic behavior. It's a body language, if you will. It reflects the micro muscles, the muscles in our hand as we write. It reflects what's going on in our brain. It's the same as any other type of nonverbal behavior, except that this is intricately connected to the words. Okay, so the handwriting is a unique nonverbal indicator in that it is connected to the words, and so the words have a very distinct effect on the handwriting. As he's writing this, he has come to terms, and he is now able to continue on with this letter, finish it out, because he's made peace with himself that that's what he's going to do. And this is kind of the calm before the storm, if you will, the calm before the traumatic occurrence of killing himself. And so this continues on, and there's cases where people have begun to write out their last letter to everyone before ending their life, and as they write, it becomes therapeutic for them, and so therapeutic that as they write, they're able to get the feelings out. And I highly recommend this for everybody, especially if you're feeling down. Write it out. Write it out, because it is therapeutic, and you can write out anything, and it acts as a pseudo. We kind of act as our own pseudo therapist, if you will, writing things out. And people have actually wrote themselves out of taking their own life because they worked it out. They worked the emotion out. They wrote the words out, and they got them out. And there's physical activity involved in writing them out, and it's therapeutic. And we see that often. And in Brian Laundrie's case, obviously, it wasn't therapeutic enough for him to not do what he did, but I do know that he came to terms with it, and he was at peace with it. And so the indication was there on the first page, talking to Gabby, and the rest of it, he's able to follow the rules and keep it together. He's come to peace with it. So that's the main thing about the handwriting, and that should answer the question of, was he actually suicidal? And if he wasn't suicidal, but was afraid, just simply afraid of the consequences of what he did, I'm not sure that you would have that. You may have some depressive traits, but you wouldn't have those suicidal traits, and there clearly is suicidal traits within that first page of his handwriting. There's a little bit throughout the rest of it, little small areas. It's way too small, but that first page is classic. Okay. All right, so that's the first thing. That's the first question. So those of you that are wondering, did he actually commit suicide? I would say yes, because he actually was suicidal. Okay, so the next question then is his account of how Gabby died truthful? So I'm going to skip to the part where he talks about just that, okay? The first thing he says is, this occurred as an unexpected tragedy. It kind of came out of the blue in his writing. This occurred as an unexpected tragedy. Okay, so what he's doing there is, that's distancing language. He's comparing it to an unexpected tragedy. This occurred as an unexpected tragedy. He didn't say Gabby's death was an unexpected tragedy, it was an accident, or anything like that. So he's comparing it. He wants you to believe that. And he wants you to believe that it was unexpected. Now, it could have been unexpected in the sense that it was a crime of passion. That is very typical in a DV, domestic violence situation. Things get heated, argument escalates, and the passion takes control, and things happen. So it could have been unexpected, but he's comparing it to something that was unexpected. Okay, so this is distancing language, and it's definitely not something that I would expect to hear from someone that is telling the truth, that experienced this. So then he says, rushing back to our car, trying to cross the streams of Spread Creek before it got too dark to see, too cold. All right, so he used the element of timing. Rushing. He tells us that there was rushing involved. He didn't say, though, who was rushing. He didn't say we were rushing back to our car. We were trying to get there before it got too dark, too cold. That is not in the equation. There is no we there. There's no connection with Gabby at that point in time. And as people recall what occurred, they will recall it as they felt it at the time, if they are truthful. And what he's doing here is he is telling this story, but he's telling it like a novel would read. And there's no psychological connection to her as he writes this. He wants you, the reader, to fill in the gap that there was psychological connection and that they were rushing back to their car and they were trying to get there before it got too dark to see and before it got too cold. But his writing, his language is segmented and it's distancing. There's no commitment there with the pronouns. The pronouns are the most powerful thing, and there's nothing there. So the element of timing is employed when it is necessary to make the story believable or to draw you in. It is often used in a fictitious novel. That typically is what the element of timing does. When I see the element of timing, I expect that there will probably be more. I look for it to see if there is going to be more. I'm already leaning towards that he's probably not telling the truth about what occurred when Gabby died. Notice also all the present tense language, not what happened in the past tense. Rushing back to our car, trying to cross the streams of Spread Creek before it got too dark. Okay, it's just present tense. This is narrative building. This is also how a novel, a fictitious novel, would be written. Past tense, experiential memory is what we would expect if he's telling us about something that actually occurred, that he actually experienced. Now, we also have a more novel narrative building type things. He created this conflict, trying to cross the creek before it got too cold and dark. Now, this tells me also that it was not too cold or too dark yet, okay? At the time that he is thinking about here, it's before that time, before it got too dark and before it got too cold. All right, so that's important. And oftentimes when people are making something up, they forget. They try to create the storyline, but they forget what they wrote and what they said. And they kind of throw a wrench in their own story. The next thing he says is, I hear a splash and a scream. This is still present tense language, not I heard a splash and a scream, but I hear a splash and a scream. This is still the narrative building. When we remember something and recall something that occurred in the past tense, we do so by referring to it in the past tense. I note that especially when people begin, when they have elements within their writing that are correctly in the past tense, and then they slip into the present tense, that typically is the part that they are making up. They're living it in their brain at that moment in time. It's like this reel, this movie reel playing within their brain, and they're recalling it as they see it, not as they experienced it. So as they see it in present tense at the current time. And so it naturally comes out in present tense language because it's occurring right now in their brain. It does fall in line with the narrative building, okay? Something that he's living at the moment. He says, I could barely see. I couldn't find her for a moment. Shouted her name. So he ejected himself psychologically when he says shouted her name. He ejected himself out. There's no I there. I shouted her name. He's not saying that. So there's no commitment there. If he can't commit to it, you shouldn't either. And I'm not. I certainly am not. So he says, I could barely see. I couldn't find her for a moment. Shouted her name. So there may be a moment that he couldn't find her. I don't know exactly what happened there with Gabby. Whether he came back, left her for a moment, came back, didn't know exactly where it was. I don't know. But I do know that there's no commitment to I shouted her name. Now listen to this. He says, I found her breathing heavily, gasping my name. She was freezing cold. He put himself psychologically in that. I found her breathing heavily, gasping my name. She was freezing cold. There may be some truth to that. She may have been gasping heavily, or breathing heavily and gasping his name. It's kind of an eerie thought, but that very well, that part of it could be experiential. So now he says she was freezing cold. I'm not sure what that has to do with it, except that he's going to continue to mention this being cold, her being cold, and it is part of the narrative that he wants to sell. It's part of the story that he wants us to buy. He says, we had just come from the blazing hot national parks in Utah. The temperature had dropped to freezing and she was soaking wet. Now, if the temperature had dropped to freezing, time has passed, because he previously told us that they were trying to make it back to their car. They were rushing back. He didn't say they, but said rushing back to the car, trying to get there before it got too cold and too dark to see. Now he's saying the temperature had dropped to freezing and she was soaking wet. So this is him selling the story of Gabby being freezing cold. And he's going to repeat this thing about her being cold. This is to bolster his reason for taking her life. He says, I carried her as far as I could down the stream towards the car. What a hero. He's describing himself as a hero. I carried her as far as I could down the stream towards the car. Stumbling, exhausted, in shock. You can put big red X's right before each of those, because he ejected himself psychologically, meaning he's not committing to it. We aren't either. The stumbling, exhausted, in shock, there's no psychological commitment to that. Otherwise, he would have said, I was stumbling, I was exhausted, I was in shock, or something like that, where there's some form of commitment, but there's none. He says, when my knees buckled and I knew I couldn't safely carry her. He's concerned for his own safety. He's not concerned for hers. I started a fire and spooned her as close to the heat. She was so thin, had already been freezing too long. He wants us to believe that because she had already been freezing too long, she was so thin. I wonder if there was an element of timing in her death, if this took longer than it should have. It's a terrible even thought, but time is passing, and she was a thin person, I get it, but it's strange that he would mention that she was so thin. What would that have to do with anything, and why even use that as part of the convincing? He says she was so thin, had already been freezing too long. He dropped the pronoun she there. There's no she had already been freezing too long. There's nothing there. She was so thin, comma, had already been freezing too long. So he's using that had already been freezing too long as a reason why she was so thin. So I know that being thin, there's an elevated sensitivity about that, and it makes me wonder if she hadn't eaten because she wasn't able to, or something like that. She was perhaps suffering at that time for a period of time. He says, I couldn't at the time realize that I should have started a fire first, but I wanted her out of the cold, back to the car. I couldn't at the time realize that I should have started a fire first, but, so that but refutes or minimizes what he just said and makes what comes after it more important. I wanted her out of the cold, back to the car. Okay, so this cold theme continues. And he's giving us more reason for her being cold. He didn't start a fire first. And he says, from where I started the fire, I had no idea how far the car might be. Okay, another reason for Gabby being cold. Then he drops the pronoun again. He psychologically ejects himself here. Only knew it was across the creek. Okay, I think he had a pretty good idea where he was. When they eject that pronoun, eject themselves psychologically, it tells me that it's probably just the opposite. And he says, when I pulled Gabby out of the water, she couldn't tell me what hurt. She had a small bump on her forehead that eventually got larger. Her feet hurt. Her wrist hurt. How does he know that if she couldn't tell him what hurt? This is part of the reason that we have him psychologically distancing himself from this, the distancing language. And he is incongruent. He's contradicting himself in his language here, and this is typically what happens. Her feet hurt, her wrist hurt, but she was freezing. He just minimized that. Her feet hurt, her wrist hurt, and he, like I said, he couldn't have known that if she couldn't articulate to him what hurt. She was freezing, shaking violently. While carrying her, she continually made sounds of pain. Laying next to her, she said little, lapsing between violent shakes, gasping in pain, begging for an end to her life. Okay, she said little, okay? She couldn't articulate where she hurt, all right? Now, he says lapsing between violent shakes, and he has that word in violent. He's describing how violent, what these shakes were like, and that they were violent. Okay, typically when they do that, he's grabbing a word that connects to actually what happened. Okay, that violent word didn't just appear. There's a connection to it. So whatever occurred there was violent. Gasping in pain, but he's not connecting a pronoun to it. He doesn't want to psychologically connect it. But there probably was some gasping in pain. Now, here's the part I do not believe. Begging for an end to her pain. He didn't say she was begging for an end to her pain or what she said. She couldn't even articulate to him, he said, where she hurt. Okay? Which means if she was making sounds, it was the sounds of pain, like he said. He probably heard that. That may be experiential. There was certainly violence involved. That's where that word came from. But she was not begging for an end to her pain. Then he said, she would fall asleep, and I would shake her. I would shake her. awake, and here's why. I would shake her, fearing she shouldn't close her eyes if she had a concussion. Now he's all concerned for her. Okay? She would wake in pain, start the whole painful cycle again, while furious that I was the one waking her. All right. Again, this is another word that it's not a word I would expect that he would use to describe these last moments with Gabby. That word, furious, just like the word violent, it came from somewhere, something that he experienced. And he's putting the onus of that word furious on her. She was furious. And why? Towards me, Brian, that I was the one waking her. It tells me that she likely was furious at him for whatever it was, and something as simple and benign as waking her. It tells me that there was probably issues within the relationship that built to that passion that led to this violent ending of Gabby's life. She wouldn't let me try to cross the creek, thought like me that this fire would go out in her sleep and she'd freeze. So it wasn't Gabby that thought. He dropped the pronoun again. She thought like me. He didn't say that, just thought like me that this fire would go out in her sleep, not while she slept, in her sleep, and she'd freeze. How does he know what she was thinking? And she couldn't even describe her pain. See, it doesn't work. It's incongruent. He says, I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries. I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries. And it makes me wonder how many injuries there were. Only that she was in extreme pain. I ended her life. And that extreme pain is associated with, I ended her life is associated with extreme pain, and he doesn't know the extent of her injuries. And it makes me wonder again how long this had been going on. If this sounds to me like there was an elongation of time here where this incident was occurring. He says, I thought it was merciful. He says, I ended her life. I thought it was merciful that it is what she wanted. That it is what she wanted. Not that it was what she wanted, that it is what she wanted. This is his current thought. But I see now all the mistakes I made. Plural mistakes. Okay? Plural. Elongation. More than one incident. More than one point in time. I panicked. I was in shock. But from the moment I decided, took away her pain, what a great guy to take away her pain. He's trying to portray that. I knew I couldn't go on without her. And so Brian Laundrie is portraying himself as a great guy. This whole narrative that he's trying to feed to us about how Gabby died and it was a mercy killing is deceptive. That is a lie. It did not happen that way, and there's indication within here that that Gabby suffered over a period of time, and it didn't happen just all at once. This was building up, and she was furious. It was violent. He was shaking her. I believe those were true. I believe that he heard her gasping for air, maybe gasping his name. She may have been begging in some way for him to not, at some point in time, to quit. All that is in his language. And so it's very interesting. And you know, when someone commits a crime of passion and then realizes what they've done and has time to set in, well, there can be legitimate remorse. And as that remorse sets in, for whatever reason, whether it's remorse or fear of what's going to happen, fear of being out of control, not being able to control the rest of his life, severe depression can set in, even for the most narcissistic or worst individuals in society. They can commit suicide, and they can become depressed, and to the point where they end where they end their own life. And so I think that we now have our answers from his own writing, that he was in fact suicidal, and his account of how Gabby died is not experiential. He gave us much more. He painted us a pretty good picture of how Gabby died. One final element to this, although Brian is writing this letter to make it back to his family and other people, obviously the public, isn't it interesting that he never tells his family goodbye? He didn't tell Gabby, see you soon. He didn't say his goodbyes. And that tells me that at a minimum, his family knew what he was going to do. I don't think they assisted him physically, but they knew what he was going to do. And so otherwise, I think we would have a goodbye in there. This was simply one of those things that he wrote this knowing that they already knew what he was going to write about. They knew what he was going to do. And so that's why you don't have his goodbyes to his mom or dad or best friends or whoever it is. So they knew, especially the parents. Otherwise, I think you would have a goodbye, mom and dad. I hope that helps. It's a pretty morbid thought, but I hope that helps everybody in their resolve and answering a lot of the questions that are out there regarding Gabby Petito and how Brian Laundrie ended his life. If you like this video, if you found it helpful, please subscribe to my channel, the Truth2Lies channel. If you want to know more, if you want to learn how to do this on your own, I have some fantastic courses. Go to my website, check out the courses. They are very easy to go through, very understandable. You'll enjoy them. They're great courses. Go there to my website and check those courses out. And in the meantime, shake all this off of you, get into a positive state, stay positive, and I'll see you next time.